Hey y'all, so last week and the weeks before that we've been getting into the French and Indian War. We figured out who was fighting. We figured out that the French and the natives are fighting on one side against the British and other natives. We figured out that they were mainly fighting over land. We know that they want the resources off of that land. We found out last week through our video that the British and the natives fighting on the British side did end up winning the French and Indian War. So now we're moving on a little bit, and our key question for today is, what are the effects of the French and Indian War? We know that effects with an E means what happened after. So we're moving on to what happened after the French and Indian War. You saw this map last week because this is the map about the Treaty of Paris. Before the war is on the left. We see that we have British territory in purple, French territory in yellow, and the land that they are fighting over has the lines across it in the middle. They're of course fighting over that land in particular because they want to be by all the rivers for those different resources. We see that the British are along the coast where we know they were, and then the French have all of the land by the rivers and by the Great Lakes. But to the right of this is what happens and what the land looks like after the war. The biggest thing that we notice is that all of the yellow is gone, which tells us that all of the French territory is gone, which makes sense because if the British won the war, then the British of course would get more land, and they did. So one effect, or one thing that happened after the French and Indian War, is the British gained a ton of land, and the French, of course, lost it. Now, I know we might be thinking, yay, the British won. Everything sounds great. The British colonists have more land. They have enough land for all of their population. But of course, we're not going to end there. I'm going to take a second to do some math to see where the problem is now. So what you're going to do is add up all of these costs to figure out how much it costs for one British soldier to fight in this French and Indian War. So you see there are different supplies like a red coat, leather backpack, 2 pairs of pants, a leather belt, a cartridge box, a cooking kit, a black hat, 2 pairs of socks, pay attention to that, and 1 Brown Bess musket. That's of course his weapon. So take a few minutes to figure out the total cost for one soldier and then the total cost for the whole British Army. How you're going to figure out the cost for the whole British Army is in the introduction at the top. It tells you that there's 27,000 British soldiers serving in America during the French and Indian War. So take a few minutes, do some math, and figure that out. You should have noticed that it costs about $114 per soldier to fight. And there's 27,000 soldiers fighting. So you should have came out with some large number that looks something like this. This number today, of course, is a lot of money in today's time, but especially if you think about how much money this would have been in the British and the French and Indian War time, it makes it even that much higher. But there are some things we left off that list, like the cost of the uniform and weapons for the Native Americans that were helping the British, food for all of the soldiers, the Navy ships, the supplies for the sailors, the transportation costs when they needed more soldiers to move into North America, actually paying those soldiers to fight, and the horses and wagons to move around. So even though that number is on the previous slide is very large, it's in fact even more than that. So you should be starting to think about, wow, this war costs a lot of money for the British. If you were to think about it, you yourself would not be that happy if you were in a lot of debt, if you spent a lot of money on things and you didn't have any money left, and in fact, you owed people money. So the British are going to feel that same way. Well, the British are the ones who paid for the food, for the uniforms, for the weapons, for the British colonists to fight. So Britain is going to do something to the British colonists to help pay this debt back. Of course, they're going to make them pay taxes, and not just a little bit of taxes. They're going to make them pay a lot. Our next activity is going to help you see how it would feel to be one of those colonists and just how silly some of those taxes really were. Alright, for this activity I need you to go grab some candy. Yes, I said candy. It'll work better if you have something like Skittles or M&Ms or Starburst or anything like that, because each little piece of candy will count as $1 that you're going to have to pay in taxes. If you don't have any candy lying around or you're trying to be healthy like me lately, you can find some grapes, find any kind of food where you can eat afterwards. It'll give you a little snack. You're also going to have to keep track of how many taxes you're paying to me, King George. I know we have to get cheesy every now and then, so I added my crown, and I'm now King George. As you know, Britain is in a great deal of debt due to this silly little French and Indian War. It is your responsibility, British colonists, to provide for your country and to help repay that debt. I've sent 2 members of Parliament across the Atlantic Ocean to supervise and help me collect these taxes. I knew you wouldn't mind. If anybody's caught stealing, refusing to pay, or eating their money for any purpose other than paying their taxes, you're going to have a harsh punishment. Alright, guys, first thing I need you to do is to have all of your money scattered out in front of you. You're going to put it on one side of your table or desk or whatever you're sitting at, and then I'm going to tell you who has to pay a tax. If you're one of these people or have one of these things, then just move your candy or grape or whatever you chose to use to the other side of your table. That's going to show us how many taxes you ended up having to pay. So, the first tax that I, King George, am going to make my colonists pay is if you're wearing any shoes or socks right now. Second one, this is going to be mainly for girls, of course. If your hair is in a ponytail. My third tax is if you are wearing anything blue. Number 4, if you're sitting in your bedroom. Tax number 5, if you drank water at all today. I hope you have. Tax number 6, if you like pizza. Tax number 7, plays a sport, or if you like watching sports in general. And our last tax, I think I'm going to get everybody on this one. If you have a door to your house, you'll pay a tax. Alright guys, that was just a little activity to see how you would feel as one of the colonists to have to pay all these taxes on these silly things pretty much for no reason. Because the colonists never asked to fight in the French and Indian War to begin with. Britain wanted the British colonists to fight in the war so that they can get more land for Britain. So even though the taxes, of course, weren't as silly as those ones that you just paid, a lot of them were still pretty silly. So we're going to look at just 3 of them. And there's a little description there for you, and you're going to have to tell me what that tax means in your words. So our first tax that our colonist has to pay is called the Sugar Act of 1764. It required more duties or taxes paid on imports of molasses/sugar and prohibited ships from transporting commodities directly to the colonies. The ships had to sail to Great Britain, unload their cargo, pay their tax, reload all of their cargo, and then sail to the colonies if they wanted to trade with them. Like I said, it's a pretty silly tax. Everybody wants sugar. Everybody wants sugar now, and in the colonist times they wanted it too. So how would you feel if you had to pay an extra tax on absolutely everything that had sugar in it? I know I wouldn't be the biggest fan. That's our first example of the silly taxes that the colonists had to pay. Silly tax number 2 is called the Stamp Act of 1765. It required the purchase of stamps to be placed on certain documents. This tax was against the colonists directly. Having to pay and have a stamp to us today doesn't sound like that big of a deal because we just really don't use them that often. If we want to talk to friends or a family member, we would call them, we would text them, and it's of course much simpler. But in the colonist times, they wouldn't be able to do that. So when Britain told the British colonists that they had to pay taxes on these stamps, that of course hurt them a lot more, and they were having to pay a ton of taxes on these stamps. Because every time they wanted to communicate with someone in one of the other 3 regions, or if they wanted to talk if they had family back in Britain, they were having to pay an extra tax and purchase these stamps just to be able to communicate with them. Our last one we'll look at today is called the Quartering Act of 1765, and it said that colonists had to provide housing, food, and drinks to British troops stationed in their towns. Yeah, so this one pretty much said that they had to take care of the soldiers that they didn't even want there in the first place. Even if they didn't have money to take care of those soldiers, they had to. For your last thought of the day, the last thing that I want to leave you off on is thinking about if you were one of these British colonists. How would you feel about everything going on right now? We had the Navigation Acts a while back that we talked about, that the colonists weren't allowed to trade with anyone, or they had to pay all those extra taxes. Now here's some examples of even more taxes that the colonists are having to pay. So if you put yourself in their place, how are you feeling?